Anyway, good afternoon. This is week 3 of Stalin's revolution. We're going to get into him as a war leader, basically. And of course, we have to go through, and that's going to encompass Nazi Germany's attack on the Soviet Union. And last week it left off, perhaps, Mr. Molotov's visit to Nazi Germany in November of 1940, and it seems at this point that frail Nazi-Soviet amalgamation is beginning to come apart. Britain survived the Blitz, and Hitler ordered the attack on the Soviet Union in the fall of 1940. And even some of his generals at this time, warned that Britain had not been defeated. And they said, even you, meaning Hitler, warned that, Germany should not fight a two-front war. And Hitler's counter-argument, and there is some merit to this counter-argument, that yes, despite the fact that perhaps Britain did not capitulate, it's still not a threat. And an active front, a quick active front on the Eastern Front would be the only active front. And perhaps if we can defeat the Soviets, it will show the British the futility of further resistance. Now, keep in mind and Hitler proposed that they invade May 1941, May 15, 1941. However, due to Italian bungling, this is part of the reason the invasion will be delayed, due to Italian bungling in the Balkans. I mean, Mussolini's trying to show he's a great conqueror too. I mean, it's Mussolini who subscribed to that saying, we're liable to miss the bus. The Germans were conquering left and right. We have to get into this. And Mussolini wanted to make sure he was going to be one of the decision makers when the war is over with. In fact, he will say, I want to make sure that there's going to be 1,000 Italian dead sitting at the conference table. Well, we know by the end of the war, it's going to cost Italy more than 1,000 dead. But, Mussolini had taken Albania, then he strikes out to invade the Greece, Greece. And the Greeks were pretty good mountain fighters, and Greece is very mountainous. Some of you folks who have been there will know that. And the Greeks waited until the Italian supply lines were strung out, and then they struck. They not only pushed Italian troops out of Greece, the Greeks had the temerity to invade Albania. Well, Hitler can't countenance this. He has to, he's building up troops in Poland and in Hungary. He's going to attack the Soviet Union. He has to make sure his southern flank is shored up. So some of these forces he's going to use to attack the Soviet Union, he has to use to invade the Balkans. Heinz Guderian is later going to say, the great armored general is going to say, we don't even attack the Soviet Union, and I've already got 600 miles on my tanks. And he doesn't want it, but you have no choice. And so they'll take Yugoslavia and they'll take Greece in the spring of 1941. In addition to, after that, landing airborne troops, Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, onto Crete to kick the British off Crete. The Germans have to shore up their southern flank. And so instead of invading May 15, 1941, it will be June 22nd, 1941. And, and again, getting into how Stalin, Stalin is interesting here too. I mean, the British are breaking the German code. Enigma, remember that one? Yeah. You know who gave the British really their head start? I mean, I know there's been movies made on Enigma and Colossus, the computer, and Alan Turing. It's the Poles that gave the British a head start. It wasn't for the Poles, they would have been years behind. Would have been years behind. In fact, in the late 20s, early 30s, the British and the French virtually gave up on it. It's the Poles that persisted. So the Poles were the ones that really gave the British the head start. And the British were shocked with what the Poles gave them. In fact, members of the Polish Secret Service and the British Secret Service met just prior to the German invasion of German invasion of Poland, and the Poles turned over what they had. The British were shocked. So the Poles really gave them a head start here. But that being said, the British were breaking the German code. And they warned Stalin, hey, the Germans are coming. And at the same time, the United States is breaking the Japanese Purple Code. And that was a diplomatic code. It wasn't a military code. Where the United States won't break JN 25, Japanese Navy Code 25, until early 1942. But you do pick up diplomatic traffic. And the United States will warn the Soviets, hey, Hitler's coming. And, you know, Stalin was of the type, you know, the capitalist West would like nothing better than to have Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union go to war, and then they'll march in. Whenever they tell you to do one thing, you do the opposite. Yeah, he didn't trust the West. He didn't trust his own spies. It won't be later on until he trusts what Richard Sorge is telling him later in 1941, and I'll get to that, which helps the Battle of Moscow. But Hitler is going to hurl, you know, on June 22nd, 1941, 03:15 in the morning. He's going to hurl 17,717 artillery pieces and any tank guns, over 2,500 combat aircraft, over 3,585 tanks, and 3,300,000 men. 139 divisions. This is 3/4 of the German army against the Soviets. And the Russians are caught virtually flat-footed. Virtually. Although, just prior to this, Georgy Zhukov is urging Stalin to make spoiling attacks against the German buildup, like in Poland and Hungary. And Stalin looks at him like, what are you crazy? You know, and Stalin understood. He understood history to the point that, no, it's Russian mobilization that caused the Germans to attack in 1914. And I don't want any part of this. No matter how obvious here, and you know, a Nazi-Soviet conflict will eventually be, he didn't think Hitler would attack them now. Why not? They're getting a lot of oil and a lot of raw materials. Why would they attack us now? Then look at it from Hitler's point of view. It's probably only going to be a matter of time before the United States gets with Britain and the Soviet Union. So let's knock them out now. And this is interesting. You know, when you look at the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, you know, America lost 183 planes that day. That's nothing to be proud of if you're an American. Most of those planes got knocked out on the ground. Well, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, June 22nd, 1941, Goering's Luftwaffe destroyed 1,400 Soviet aircraft the first day, 600 the next. Almost the entire frontline strength of the world's largest air force was wiped out. 2,000 aircraft. First day, 3 Soviet infantry divisions were wiped out, 5 others cut to pieces. 100,000 men are off the board in 24 hours. In a week, Heinz Guderian, that great practitioner of armor with Army Group Center, is already 1/3 the way to Moscow. He's some 220 miles deep inside the Soviet Union. In 2 weeks, the Soviets have more dead than this country will lose in the entire war. In a month, the Germans have captured an area twice the size of its own country. Now, this is not an impending defeat. This is turning out to be an unmitigated disaster. Stalin, in a meeting, storms out, saying that all that what we've worked hard for, all what Lenin laid out for us, you guys have. I don't have to go into that any farther. And he storms out. The Soviet Union's leaderless, rudderless. Forget forget the oars not being in the water, the rudder's not in the water. This boat's just floating. And so, you know, what's happening here? The Germans are advancing. That's what's happening. And so Molotov, Lavrentiy Beria, and I think it was Boris Shaposhnikov from the Soviet High Command, go to visit Stalin at his dacha. And he is not in very good shape. I mean, he looks unkempt, unshaven. And, you know, I mean, I can imagine what Stalin must have thought. You see Lavrentiy Beria on your front doorstep at 9 o'clock in the morning. This is not a good day. It's worse than having 60 Minutes knocking on your door. And, you know, thinks at this point, I'm going to get, and no, we need you. Here's a chance to get rid of them. We need you. And so he'll collect himself and go back to Moscow. And on July 3, 1941, he makes this impassioned speech when he calls this the Great Patriotic War. And it's not just to throw the Nazis out, not just to throw the Germans out, to throw the fascists out. You know, that Marxist-Leninist rallying cry against the extreme right, the fascists. In the meantime, things aren't going quite so well. A General Popov, who faces Army Group Center, Stalin will order him shot. You got to say one thing for Stalin. You know, during the Second World War, I don't know how many people remember that movie, The Execution of Private Eddie Slovak. That movie's, it's been a while since that movie was released. But the only soldier this country will shoot in World War II for cowardice. And supposedly, anyway, the Germans will shoot some 22,000 and change for cowardice in World War II. The Soviets, on 158,000. And you got to say one thing about Stalin. He was quite liberal about it. He will shoot 248 generals and admirals. It wasn't just privates, corporals, and sergeants. And this is going to lead to something later known as the penal battalions, the Strafbats. And I remember when Eisenhower went to the Soviet Union, you know, when the European war is over, he wanted to see Stalingrad, and his tour guide here, boy, that must have been a tour. His tour guide was Georgy Zhukov. And, you know, I mean, that must have been quite a little entourage going through the rubble of Stalingrad. And one of the questions Eisenhower's going to ask is, what about the minefields? How did you guys clear the minefields? Strafbats. Oh, what the heck is a Strafbat? The penal battalions. These are the guys they'd send running through the minefields. And Eisenhower says, my God, the high casualty rate, Zhukov, no, you know, it's not much different than if you send an infantry through an attack through a mortar or an artillery barrage. Strafbats. And now these guys were guys who didn't show the required intestinal fortitude in battle. And if you survived, you were put back in a line unit. I'm convinced Stalin put some of his political malcontents here too, to get rid of them. And so they would use these guys as to clear the minefields, the machine gun fodder before you send in a good line unit. And, and at one point, they had 178 men in these Strafbat units. And, Stalin, when he's questioned about things like this, or shooting 158,000 men for so-called cowardice, you got to admit, Stalin had a macabre sense of humor here when he mentioned, shooting all these soldiers. He said it took a brave man to be a coward in the Red Army. And so, but you see this country try to come together in 1941. this is a country that, again, I mentioned before, Stalin's program of forced industrialization. The order comes down, and Russians, and Russians have said, from this period, that it seems like the country was tilted east. Everything that wasn't nailed down, screwed down, bolted on was loaded on trains and sent east. And Stalin ordered as many factories as possible, send them east. And they're going to pack up 1,546 factories and move them to the Urals, beyond range of the Luftwaffe. Things that couldn't be carried would be blown up or burned. Stalin ordered that even villages are to be scorched, because when the winter comes, if we can hold out that long, there will be no shelter for German troops. This is the scorched earth policy, is what it's going to be. And so as the Germans are moving east, and the Soviets were not supposed to give ground. And this helps to account for the early part of the German victory. Keep in mind here, Hitler's idea, he learned from Napoleon. Napoleon got Moscow, didn't he? But could he hold it? No. Hitler's idea, we need to destroy the German army in the field. He wasn't so much excited about taking a lot of territory. Let's go 100, 150, 200 miles and pinch off large pockets of the Soviet army and then annihilate them. That's the idea here. But one of the many problems the Germans faced is what worked in France in 1940 won't work quite as well in the Soviet Union in 1941. Why? Compare the size of France to the Soviet Union. How far is it from Sedan or the Ardennes Forest to the Channel? It's not really all that far. But once you invade the Soviet Union, some German soldiers were talking about the steppe. It's just one step after another, after another, after another. This town's not on the map. That's because we've run off the map. And many of these German soldiers are going to feel this. And so, and another aspect of this, the railroads. You would think, well, the Germans can use the railroads, right? Yeah, they could. But originally, now you got to rip up the tracking and put European gauge tracking down, because the Soviet tracking or Russian tracking, the gauge is different. How are you going to move your supplies? Another aspect of this, the Germans were not as mechanized as many people here think. Germany made less than 400,000 trucks during the war. Compare that to the United States. We make over 2,600,000 trucks. Germans made less than 400,000 trucks. Part of this is because Germany was virtually oil-starved. They're still moving troops by horse and wagon. They invade the Soviet Union with 600,000 motor vehicles. Keep in mind, they're going to make up the shortfall of Mercedes and Opel trucks with captured French and Czech trucks. Not as robust as German types, but you use what you use. They're also going to invade with 625,000 horses. So many German soldiers in 1941 were still moving like their fathers were moving in 1914. And so when I go back to what I mentioned just a few minutes earlier, Heinz Guderian and his tanks, Panzer Group 2, he's moving at 40, 50 miles a day. And yet, some of his supplies, horse-drawn transport, how many miles a day you think horse-drawn transport's doing? 15, 17, maybe. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. 20? That opens up a gap between the lead elements and the supplies. And keep in mind here, too, another impediment for the Germans. Only 5% of Soviet roads were paved. What happens after a heavy rain? What happens after melting snows and ice? What happens to these roads? Quagmires. So how fast do you think the trucks are moving sometimes? And so these are problems the Germans have to face. And then there's Hitler. Up to this point, the generals had a lot of say in how this war was going to run. But once we get into Russia, guess who's going to take this over? Hitler. Hitler will. Read Mein Kampf. This is his war. This is the reason for war. The future of the Reich is here. Not in France, Belgium, and Holland. What are you going to get out of that? People, wood, and wine? Who cares? The resources are in the East. And Hitler expected the Wehrmacht to take this country in 17 weeks. Moscow and just beyond. And then they were going to make the Reich. And the Russians would be stuck with nothing. That's not what's going to happen here. Hitler, all of a sudden now, you get to the end of July, what's interesting here is you've got 4 huge pockets of trapped Soviets. 4 huge pockets from Bialystok to Smolensk at one point. And at one point, the Germans have 32 infantry divisions and 8 Soviet tank divisions surrounded in 4 pockets. Yet, because of the fact that this country is so vast, and even though German armored units are able to pincer off these huge pockets, troops moving by horse can't fill the gaps in the pockets. And so many Soviet troops are escaping, moving east, which is a good thing for the Soviets. Yet, in one setting, in single settings, the Germans are capturing 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 at a time. It's interesting too when you go to the Navy Department and you want to find out how many Americans were taken prisoner, POWs in World War II. The Navy Department will tell you in World War II, 130,000 uniformed Americans were taken prisoner in World War II. Plus another 19,000 civilians. So let's say round numbers, 150,000 in World War II. At Kiev alone, September 16, 1941, which Hitler stated this is the greatest victory in German arms. Heinz Guderian and Panzer Group 2 and Ewald von Kleist and Panzer Group 1 closed their armored pincers just to the east of Kiev, and they captured 665,000 Russians. Almost anybody else, that's the end of the game, it's over. Not the Russians. Most of these were Russian troops. Some were guerrillas. Some were opolchenie, or factory workers, which formed these militias. Some were Russian civilians, but 665,000 in one setting. Hitler thinks this is just about over with. Russian army is almost destroyed. No, it's not. Again, this is a kind of war Americans have no clue about. We don't know. Let me tell you something. Last year, 2 years ago, if President Obama had to go before the American public on television and radio and tell the American public that 665,000 Americans had been captured by the Taliban, this country wouldn't know whether to poop or go blind. It wouldn't. It wouldn't. The country doesn't fall. The Russians fight on. Of course, part of this is Hitler. He stops Army Group Center, and he sends some of his tanks north to take Leningrad. Then he sends tanks south to get into the Caucasus, or get into Ukraine and get the oil in the Caucasus. Heinz Guderian argues with Hitler. Give me that. Sounds like George C. Scott in the movie Patton. You give me that gas and that ammunition, and I'll go clear to Moscow. My God, my tanks that far behind the lines? What's the big deal? As I grab territory, the Luftwaffe I can make temporary airfields and I can be supplied. I'll go straight to Moscow. Let's get them before they wake up. No. No. Wants to take Leningrad. Why? Because it's a port. If we can grab Leningrad, we can have German ships bring supplies in. Oh, and by the way, Leningrad will cease to exist as a city. We're going to wipe it off the map. The Germans won't be able to take Leningrad. Georgy Zhukov will be sent here to organize the defense. Stalin sends Zhukov to Leningrad to organize the city's defense. And the political commissar here is a man by the name of Andrei Zhdanov. He will organize the people. Zhukov will organize the military defenses. The Germans cannot break into Leningrad. They're going to destroy the city via the Luftwaffe and artillery shelling. This will start the greatest siege in the 20th century. 872 days, this city will be cut off from help. The worst part of the siege is December 1941, January, February 1942. 3,000 or 4,000 a day are dying in this city. It's a city of 3 million. By the time this is over with, this city will incur more dead than the British and American totals in World War II combined. The city will survive. It's a real tribute to the human spirit. But also there's other things at work here. Hatred of the Germans, Communist Party zeal, love for my city. You know how some people are about their city. I don't have to tell you that. Aren't there some people who are really enamored with Darien living here? Maybe have been born here? Of course. That's what you'd expect. Hitler will eventually take his tanks from the Army Group North, apply them to Army Group Center. Same thing from Army Group South, pull them back to Army Group Center, make the beeline to Moscow. And so by October, Army Group Center is on its way to Moscow. Russian troops are trying to delay the attack on Moscow. But of course, what's happening in Russia in October, November? Yeah. The traditional Russian ally, General Winter. That's what some people would call him, General Winter. Trade space for time. I mean, what happened to Napoleon's Grand Army when the winter struck? Yeah. And some of these German soldiers are still in their summer uniforms. And Georgy Zhukov Stalin orders Zhukov from Leningrad to Moscow, organize the city's defenses. And finally, Stalin will believe one of his spies, Richard Sorge, in Tokyo. Japan's not interested in Siberia. Japan is interested in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies. Isn't that where the oil is? Keep in mind the impact here. Didn't Roosevelt cut off the Japanese? He froze their assets July 26, 1941. Because on July 24, the Japanese completed their total occupation of French Indochina. So he cut them off. The Japanese lose 80% of their oil imports. So obviously they're going to attack the Dutch East Indies. The wells are already there. All you got to do is grab them. And so Georgy Zhukov will be able to count on a reserve from Asia, from Siberia. 40 divisions of the Soviet Far Eastern Army. Among the best trained troops in Russia, trained to fight in winter conditions. Keep in mind the Soviet losses here. You know, this is a country that, you know, in June 1941, in June 1941, the world's tank population is 40,000 units. That's if you took the major powers and added up all the inventories. Approximately 40,000 units. Hitler attacks the Soviet Union with 3,585 tanks. You know how many tanks the Soviets had? 22,700. Now you're wondering, well, how did the Germans pull this off? What you call blitzkrieg, Schwerpunkt, or armored warfare. Mobile attack. You know, there was that close coordination between the German armored units and the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was a tactical air force, not strategic. And so even though the Nazis are outnumbered over 6-1 in tanks, the Germans always made that, they always put their tanks in overwhelming numbers at those places chosen for their armored thrusts, where the Soviets are feeding their tanks in piecemeal, and therefore getting chopped up. Same mistake the French made the summer before, in 1940. In fact, in 2 battles, Minsk and Smolensk on the Eastern Front, the Soviets lost upwards of 6,000 tanks. I mean, their blazing hulks just littered the countryside. And so by the end of November 1941, Hitler's forces are beginning to surround Moscow. At one point, 2 million people were evacuated from Moscow. Stalin orders it stopped. Not one step back. Stalin, he could have beat feet. He stays. He's going to stay in Moscow. That's showing some intestinal fortitude. The NKVD, secret police, are stopping people from leaving Moscow. The Red Army will fight for a live city in lieu of a dead one. People are put to work, digging tank traps, trenches, ditches, building blockhouses in Moscow. And the Nazi idea for Moscow, when they take it, they're going to wipe it off the face of the earth and build a giant reservoir. And as they get closer to Moscow, they're going to try to encircle the city. And so Zhukov is able to bring in some divisions from that Far Eastern Army with 1,000 tanks, which he needs. And as the Germans get closer, the temperature is dropped 20, 30, even 40 below zero. Some German soldiers cannot cut sticks of butter with their combat knives. Axes are bouncing off the carcasses of dead horses. They can't eat that. Some German soldiers are dying in this cold because they can't relieve themselves. Their anal pores are congealing. And it's at this point where the lead German spearheads can see the spires of the Kremlin 15 miles away. Zhukov unleashes his counterattack. He launched a spoiling attack in a place called Tula on November 27. But it's on the night, and they do it at night on December 4-5, 1941, on a front 600 miles across. The Germans have to fall back 100 miles, some places 150 miles. Hitler states, stay and fight, not one step back. Some German officers are just pulling their men back to shorten their lines, to stabilize their defenses. And this together, and keep in mind, this is on the night of December 4-5, 1941. 2 days later, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. Now the United States is in the war. Now the United States and the Soviet Union, the world's number one and number two industrial powers, are now on the same side. And both countries have that resource you need to fight a modern, industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war. Oil. We don't have to go get it. We got it. Not so the Germans, Italians, and Japanese. The Germans are now consigned to a long war of attrition they can't afford to wage. This idea of winning a quick victory, the Russians put a stop to it. But of course, at a cost. You know, when the Soviet offensive peters out, you know, you go to March 1942 and take a look at the cost. The Germans had upwards of 200,000 dead on the Eastern Front, first part of the war. Almost 750,000 wounded, some 46,000 missing. They're missing a million casualties. The Soviets, 2 million battlefield dead. Upwards of 3.5, 4 million have been taken prisoner. 3.5 or 4 million taken prisoner. And of this, at least 2.5 million of them are already dead. Battle, so the Russian army has lost upwards of 4.5 million dead, and this war isn't even a year old. That doesn't count the civilians, folks. We haven't even counted them. The Germans, the horse, getting back to the horse I mentioned earlier. You know, the Germans were using horses that came from Europe. You think they're used to this weather in the Soviet Union? German horses were dying starting at 4 degrees below zero. Soviet horses from Siberia, used for Kalmyk and Cossack cavalries, and used to move supplies, guns, men. Those ponies were still operating at 35 degrees below zero. And they could survive 57 below if you kept them in shelter. They were more robust than the German trucks. They were. The great thing is, if they died, you could eat them. Truck you can't eat. Hitler. He knows he knows he has to beat the Soviet Union at this point. However, he cannot attack like he did in 1941, of course, the length and breadth of the Soviet Union. He's going to have to tailor this attack. Stalin is still learning here. You know, having pushed the Germans back from Moscow, he wants to launch a huge counterattack in Ukraine, which he's going to do. They still need to learn the rudiments of mobile warfare like the Germans have. And what the Germans know from mobile warfare, they put to use defensively. And the Russians are going to launch an attack in the south. They will go deep within the German lines. The Germans will wait until the Soviet spearheads are strung out and then envelop them and annihilate them. It will cost the Soviets 600 tanks. This will begin the German riposte. Attack the Caucasus and grab the oil. At the same time, Stalingrad. If we can take Stalingrad, then we can move north to take Moscow and knock the Russians out of the war. And in the summer of 1942, the German offensive will start. They will take Rostov-on-the-Don and then go into the Caucasus. However, Hitler still expects the German Sixth Army to take Stalingrad, together with 4th Panzer Army. And by August, early September 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad will start. Stalingrad is on the Volga River, and it stretches some 15, 16 miles north to south. In the southern portion of the city is where the old city is. It's a lot of wooden buildings, so on and so forth. In the middle is becoming what Stalin liked to call a socialist showpiece. Modern concrete, steel, so on and so forth. In the northern section of the city is the industrial area. Tractor Factory, October Revolution, these are names of factories that existed. In command will be a Vasily Chuikov, in command of the 62nd Army. Chuikov understands one thing. He understands that one of the reasons the German army is successful and continuously moves is air support from the Luftwaffe. He states that what you want to do, what his troops should do, is maintain close contact with the German troops. That negates Luftwaffe support because the Germans aren't going to bomb their own troops. And so by early September 1942, the battle for Stalingrad proper begins. The Germans shell the place and bomb the place. And you keep in mind, Chuikov turns this place into a giant blockhouse. Every block, every street, every building, sewers are turned into strong points. And when the Germans bomb and shell the place, what do you think happens in that rubble? The Russian troops are going to go into these like rats. Hitler wants this city taken. You know, now it's getting to be a thing of pride. Stalingrad. And the Germans are going to have a hard time in the rubble. And it's going to cost the Germans a lot of men. They're going to have to pinch troops from north and south of the city along the line. At one point, the Germans are having 20,000 casualties a week in this city. And some historians have called this the Verdun of World War II. The problem here is the shortage of German manpower. Sure, they're pinching troops from north and south of the city, and what are they filling them in with? Italians, Romanians, Hungarians. Troops not quite up to German standards. And September gives way to October. And this city is being fought for block by block. Every hallway, every room is fought for. The Russians can afford this, the Germans cannot. And by November 1942, the Soviets had been supplying armies to the north and to the south of Stalingrad. They give Chuikov just enough supplies to hang on. In fact, Chuikov's back is to the Volga. There is no place to go here. And at one point, the Nazis have 90% of the city. In fact, Hitler even gloats at a dinner, I believe it was in Munich. You know, we are on a city on the Volga. It's called Stalingrad. And he says, we've taken the city, you know, we really have. And he says, no, he says, I've been told, well, why don't we make a big push and take the whole city? Well, I prefer to do this with small units. Time is of no consequence. Time was more important than he realized. And the Russian buildup continues. Keep in mind what you're seeing here develop, this Soviet industrial machine. In 1942, the Germans are going to produce 5,997 tanks and assault guns. The Soviets, without our help, 24,668 tanks in 1942 alone. 13,500 of these are the superlative T-34, the best tank, bar none, made by any Allied power in World War II. Better than that junk we were making, the Sherman, which the British used to call the Ronson lighter. The only thing is, there were a lot of them. And on November 19, actually 1 million Soviet troops were north and south of Stalingrad. Von Paulus even asked, why don't we hold up and pull back and shorten our lines and attack again in the spring? No. Keep attacking. Franz Halder, his chief of staff, even warned. He said, we can't keep throwing men into this inferno. He warned that there was a buildup north and south of the city. And Hitler will fire him, saying, obviously now in the East we need National Socialist ardor instead of professional abilities to solve matters in the East. Obviously I cannot expect this from you, and he fires him. Brings in a new chief of staff, Kurt Zeitzler, who had a reputation in the German army as being a man who was aces with logistics, knowing how to move troops, which is okay with Hitler. He will move those troops where I want them moved. And Zeitzler takes a look at the situation and virtually repeats what Franz Halder, his predecessor, said. There's a buildup going on in the north and the south. And if things are not done in good time to rectify this situation, there will be a disaster. To Hitler's reply, we have been in worse predicaments in this on the Eastern Front than before you joined us. We'll get through our present difficulties too. And on November 19, 1942, the northern pincers of the Soviet counterattack start, followed a day later by the southern pincers. And 3 days later, they will meet 60 to 70 miles west of Stalingrad and pincer the city off. The Russians think they've trapped 75,000 men. Actually, they've trapped 250,000. Paulus wants to break out. Hitler says, stay put, I'll break in. And Erich von Manstein, a brilliant general, will lead the counterattack to open up a roadway to Stalingrad. He has 60 miles to go. He will do 30, and Pavel Ramistrov will stop him, a great Soviet tank army general. You know, Manstein urges von Paulus to break out. Join up with me. Von Paulus doesn't. And through the month of January, and that's another thing about Manstein, he was threatened with envelopment. He had to retreat. And the men in the Stalingrad pocket are on their own. And by February 3, 1943, the pocket capitulates. Von Paulus was promoted to field marshal, Hitler knowing that no field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. He expected von Paulus to shoot himself. Von Paulus won't shoot himself. In fact, later on, the Soviets will offer von Paulus as trade bait to get Yakov Stalin back, Stalin's oldest son. And Stalin says no. He took his chances like everybody else. And Yakov Stalin will die later in 1943 in German captivity. Out of 330,000 men in von Paulus's 6th Army, which also contained elements of 4th Panzer Army. And there were also some Croatian and Russian volunteers captured as well as some along the line, Romanians, Hungarians. Out of 330,000 men, by February 3rd, 1943, 90,000 soldiers and 2,000 officers were taken prisoner. Within weeks, 50,000 are dead. In 1946, when the remnants of that army are repatriated to Germany, only 5,000 make it home, such as it was on the Eastern Front. It's estimated that on both sides, in this 7-month clash, 6-7-month clash, there were 1.9 million casualties. Yet, the Germans now know they have a problem here. This is going to lead to the biggest air-land battle in the history of war. Kursk in Ukraine, a city of about 120,000 people. And on that map, one of those maps, you will see in 1943 the Kursk Bulge. Hitler needs to ramp up production for tanks. Stalin, by the way, understands where the war is going. He understands, too, at this point, he's learning, too. Keep in mind, Stalin is learning here to maybe trust his generals more, particularly people like Georgy Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossovsky, Vasily Chuikov, the hero at Stalingrad. Remember when Nikita Khrushchev was actually the political commissar here, and when Chuikov's back was against the wall? Khrushchev tells Chuikov, I hope I don't have to remind you of what's going to happen here if this doesn't work. The two of them. Yet it will work. The Russians will hold on. But getting into 1943, keep in mind here too, the Americans and British have landed in French Northwest Africa. Operation Torch, November 1942. October 1942. Montgomery wins the Battle of El Alamein. So you got the Allied troops in French Morocco, and you got the British Eighth Army coming in from the east, the North African, and they're going to squeeze the Germans and then finally kick them out of North Africa. That leads to what after that? Sicily and Italy. But Hitler needs a quick victory on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel. It's the greatest air-land battle in the history of war. This battle is going to determine the course of the land war for the rest of the war. You know, the Battle of the Bulge, which is quite a battle, had 1 million men in it. Mostly American, mostly German. And so, but on the Eastern Front at Kursk, the Germans will have upwards of 1 million men by themselves. The Soviets, upwards of 2.2 million men. In that Kursk bulge, the Soviets make lines of defenses. And in some of these lines, per mile of front, 2,700 anti-vehicle and 2,400 anti-personnel mines per mile of front. Trenches, pillboxes, barbed wire. The Germans are going to have to go through line after line after line. The idea here is, why would we want to do that for? We'll attack the bulge from the north and the south, pincer it off, destroy the Soviet troops here, and then bolt for Moscow. However, it was supposed to, this offensive was supposed to be launched in May. The Germans don't have enough tanks. Hitler postpones it till June. There's not enough tanks. Hitler postpones it till July 5, 1943. It's too late. But Hitler will launch the attack anyway. General Walter Model, in command of German troops in the north, will make maybe 11 to 15 miles in that, to the top of the bulge, and he stops. He can't go any farther. General Hermann Herth in the south will get as far as 40 miles, and then he will have to stop. German losses, at one point, they're losing 10,000 dead a day. The Chinese can afford this, Germans can't. And this battle will end at a place called Prokhorovka in the southern bulge. Hitler's cream, the cream of Hitler's Panzer Corps, the SS Panzer Corps of 3 SS Panzer divisions, Das Reich, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, and Totenkopf will meet. And they have 700 tanks. And they're in a valley. And Pavel Ramistrov, who has 850 Russian tanks, it's like a cavalry charge. They come over the hill and they get down into the valley with German tanks. Some of these battles are maybe 25 yards apart. Overhead are German and Soviet tank-busting aircraft. And then when the battle's over with, there'll be 350 German Hulks and some 400 Soviet tanks burning in the valley. But the Germans are stopped. And like a giant spring coiled for a rebound, the Soviets launched their summer offensive, pushing the Germans further west. The war's already decided now, folks. The war's decided. Mr. Stalin is sitting in a good position when he goes to the Tehran Conference late November 1943. Sits down with Churchill and Roosevelt. Stalin has really come up here as a war leader. Things have changed too. The NKVD, the secret police, he used to purge the party. You know, the army has worked its way up. It's rebounded from the purges of 1937-38. Even to the point where Stalin has okayed the idea of brass and epaulets being returned to Soviet army uniforms. You know, the fringe and so on and so forth. He understands the growing power of the army. He's not stupid. Georgy Zhukov is still really the man here despite other generals like Ivan Konev, who's Zhukov's rival, Chuikov, Ramistrov, so on and so forth. Nikolai Vatutin was another one, a young general who died under mysterious circumstances in 1944. But at this point, Stalin goes into the Tehran Conference brimming with confidence. You know why? Because he knows he's the one beating the German army, not so much the British and the Americans. The Soviets are the ones doing the fighting here. Keep in mind, at 1942, the German army was 262 divisions. Guess where 200 of them were? The Eastern Front. The other 62 were sprinkled over the other fronts. 200 divisions. And so it is here at Tehran, Stalin is told by Churchill and Roosevelt, we plan on landing in France May 1944. You know, Stalin, thank you very much. And what I'm going to do is 2 weeks after those guys hit the beaches, I will launch an offensive in the east to take the pressure off the guys in the west. Gee, that's nice of them to do that. Of course, it's easy to be nice and polite if you're getting something out of this. Well, you know, Normandy is not till June 6, 1944. And you got to give these guys credit here who hit the beaches at Normandy. You know, hit the beaches, dropped by parachute, crash landed by glider. You got to give Eisenhower and his crew credit for planning this attack and then pulling it off. Landing 156,000 guys on a front 50, 60 miles wide. And they pulled it off. Yet, you know, June 6, 1944, the Soviets do keep their word. And Stalin plans a counterattack on the Eastern Front. It's called Operation Bagration. It's named after a Russian general named Peter Bagration who died fighting Napoleon. You see what Stalin's doing here? Resurrecting Russian history here? Let's get everybody involved here. Only this will not be on a front 50, 60 miles wide. This will be on a front 450 miles, later broadened to 650 miles. You can see on one of those maps there, the front, on the Eastern Front, June 1944, and the second map shows you how far the Soviets went in Belarusia. And they don't use 156,000 men. This is the largest land attack by the Allies in World War II up to this point. It's not 156,000 men, folks. It's 2,500,000. They'll have 4,070 tanks and over 6,000 combat aircraft. And the Soviets will mass 28,000 pieces of artillery. That's what the Soviets like to do. Pound, 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 pound. And Germans after the war who were on the receiving end of this say, you don't know what a Soviet artillery barrage is like. And on June 22nd, keep in mind the date, June 22nd. Stalin purposely did that. It's the 3rd anniversary of this German attack. And Soviet artillery starts up, and Georgy Zhukov and his crew will just move west. In the course of 8 weeks, German Army Group Center, which had been some 800,000 men, in 8 weeks incurs 620,000 casualties. It's virtually annihilated. There are more German casualties here than at Stalingrad. This carries the Russians from just west of Minsk up to the doorstep of Warsaw, Poland. They are on the Vistula River. They are only 350 miles from Berlin. Of course, Stalin being Stalin, the nice guy that he is, you know, the Polish Home Army rises up in Warsaw, the Warsaw Uprising. Not to be confused with the Ghetto Uprising of 1943. That was different. That was the Jewish Warsaw Ghetto. This is the Polish Home Army. Gee, they're out. The Soviets are right at the doorstep. on the Vistula River. Let's rise up. Stalin's not going to go any farther. He's going to stop. Why would he want to tangle with the Germans in Warsaw when they can eliminate the home army for me? And that will go on for 8 weeks, and upwards of 250,000 Poles will be lost. But the home army is virtually neutered or destroyed. Georgy Zhukov put a spin on this, and he probably, to a certain extent, he's probably correct, that with the 8 weeks of the Operation Bagration offensive, the Soviet army needed a break. It needed a rest. There's probably some truth to that, but something could have been done to help the home army. In fact, he denied, held up requests from the Churchill government and Washington about using American B-17s and Lancasters to drop supplies to those trapped in Warsaw and then land on Soviet territory. Stalin will finally acquiesce to this, but the Poles have lost. In fact, Stalin says, I'll help the Poles. He launched an airdrop to drop supplies. You know what they did? They put supplies in these containers and pushed them out of the Soviet aircraft without parachutes to help the Poles. Nice guys. And so by January 1945, they're into Warsaw, at which point Hitler, again, another one of these. We're going to wipe Warsaw off the map. 85% of the city is already destroyed by the time the Soviets get in here. The Germans have almost annihilated the entire city. This leads to the discussion, like at Yalta. Again, Stalin as this war leader, he's raising his stature here. He's no longer robbing banks for the Bolsheviks. He's no longer some party hack. He's no longer forming the Bolshevik party in his image. He's already done that. He's now a world leader. The man's come a long way since his father was beating him as a kid in Georgia. Berlin, the prize. Churchill and Roosevelt didn't want to take Berlin. They knew they had an idea how many casualties this is going to cost. But let's understand something here. No matter what you see in that movie, Patton, the Soviets earned the right to take Berlin. They were invaded. We weren't. They earned that right. They earned it. And they're going to take it to the Germans. In fact, all through that winter of 1944, going into when finally the Nazis will capitulate May 7, 1945, there was a great exodus west of Germans trying to get out of Poland and East Prussia. Some 2 million German women are going to be raped. And so, beginning at the end of January 1945, the Soviets will begin their plunge from Poland into Germany. Now this is where, Stalin knows how to play people. Everyone thinks Georgy Zhukov is the one that's going to get the prize. Not going to be this way. And at a Stavka meeting, the two generals will get that nod to plunge directly onto Berlin. Georgy Zhukov, as you might expect, and Ivan Konev, his rival. Whoever gets to Berlin first takes it. Well, Konev and Zhukov, these are typical Russian generals. I'll lose 2, 3, 4, 5 men to every one the Germans will lose, but I'm going to win this. This is the typical Soviet model. Although keep in mind here, folks, by 1944, Stalin had in his hands, as far as ground forces go, probably the world's premier killing machine when it came to mass use of men, tanks, guns, and planes. The world's premier killing machine. Someone asked me one time, well, if you were picking your armed forces, what would you have? I'd World War II, the United States Navy, World War II. What's not to like about this Navy? It's got the U.S. industrial potential behind it. The men were well trained. A blend of air power, surface power and submarine power. What's not to like here if you're into this sort of thing? I said the United States Army Air Force, especially with a strategic bombing capability, supply capability. Although when it came to ground power, I'll take the Soviet Army. This is an army that doesn't care how many it loses, but wants to win, no matter what. And if they don't surrender, we'll steamroller them. That's the way it's going to be. And so you're going to see this race develop between Zhukov and Konev at a place called the Seelau Heights, just outside Berlin. Zhukov has to break through these heights. He's going to have to go up a hill to break through these heights to get broken field running to Berlin. He organizes his attack forces for this. The Germans, by the way, have the heights and the swampy area below. And what Zhukov is going to do is launch this huge artillery bombardment. And he has you know how big aircraft searchlights are? He's going to have aircraft searchlights, turn them on to blind the Germans. And then the tanks will rush. What happens here is, they didn't account for, after this horrendous artillery bombardment, which the German commander pulled his men out of the forward trenches and put them back the hill. And when the artillery bombardment started, that's when he put his men back up front. But with all the dust and debris raised, what do you think happened to Soviet troops when the searchlights were turned on? They got blinded. Zhukov is held up for 3 days. It cost him 30,000 dead in 3 days to burst through the heights. He whips, cajoles, threatens, but he gets it done. Or I should say the Russian soldier got it done. And when they get to Berlin, latter stages of April 1945, and Konev will break into the southern end of the city, and Zhukov will begin to head in from the east. And it looks like Konev is going to take the city. But again, Stalin here, knowing how to play people, Konev gets to be 150 yards from the Reich Chancellery. He's ordered to stop. Zhukov's troops take the Reich Chancellery. The 150th Brigade, if you've probably seen newsreel footage of Soviet soldiers on top of the Reich Chancellery planting the red flag, that's the 150th Brigade from Zhukov's army. And when they break into the Reich Chancellery, they have to fight here floor by floor. SS and fanatics hold out. This is going to cost the Russians 100,000 dead and 200,000 wounded to take Berlin. But they take Berlin. Does this help put Stalin on the map? Yes. Is he happy about this? Yeah, of course he is. You know what's fascinating about Stalin here? Averell Harriman. Remember him? Our ambassador to the Soviet Union. Well, you know how this works. Diplomats, don't they schmooze sometimes here? Yeah, of course they do. After May 7th, 1945, talking with Stalin, gee, I'd like to congratulate the Soviet people for this great victory, and it was a great victory. And I'd like to congratulate the Soviet Army and you for your leadership. Oh boy, you're really schmoozing here. And what do you think Stalin should say? Well, convey my thanks to President Roosevelt, the American people. There's none of this. None of this. I mean, he looks back at Harriman with a face as bland as that floor, and he says, Tsar Alexander got to Paris, referencing Alexander I during the Napoleonic Wars. Tsar Alexander got to Paris. What does this lead you to suspect? Perhaps the Soviets would like to have gotten to the Channel? Keep in mind what Stalin's done here. He's created that buffer zone for the Soviet Union. Stalin understands what Mr. Putin understands right now. Germany invaded Russia 1914. The Poles invaded Russia in the 2021 Russo-Polish War. And then the big one, the recent war. Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. You know, between 1914 and 1945, you lose over 30 million people. It's time to call it quits. It's time to call quits here. You know, they've always been invaded through Poland and Ukraine. And now they're staying and they're not getting out. And if you don't like it, there's the door. You know, and you don't have to be Stalin for this. What do you think some of the Russian people are thinking? We have to keep doing this? No, we're staying. Putin understands this history. If we don't, that's considered part of the Russian sphere of influence. But then again, look at it from their perspective for just a moment. Now I'll ask you something. If the United States Southwest had been invaded through Mexico 3 times in 31 years, would Mexico be a sovereign state today? Maybe our border would be butting up against the Guatemalan frontier. And instead of McDonald's, there'd be fast food chains, tortillas are us, all over the place. And I'm not kidding. And so this is realpolitik with Stalin, which makes that Normandy invasion so much more important. And I don't think we realize this. I really don't. You know, whenever, you know, the longest day, Normandy, we always talk about this. That's fine. But I mean, there's more going on here than just a bunch of guys, American, British, Canadian, Free French. And you got to, again, you got to give these guys credit for serving Hitler as eviction notice from France and the Low Countries. You know, and don't think the Allied command doesn't understand this. You know, you can agree with the Soviets, among the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, where the armies are going to stop. But that's really going to be determined on the field of battle. And so how do you make sure you're going to have these spheres of influence carefully delineated? You got to land men in France. And so what these guys who defeated the Nazis in 44 and 45, they didn't just defeat the Nazis, they won the first big battle of the Cold War. Picture how the world would have looked if T-34 tanks made it to the Channel. Are you talking a different Cold War? Yeah, you sure are, because and don't think that Stalin doesn't understand this. The French had a sizable communist party. Italy had a sizable communist party. You had a communist party in Spain despite Franco. Interesting here what you see when you really look. Probably gives you another idea of why the A-bombs were dropped on Japan. Let's get this over with. And another thing, Stalin kept his word again. You know, they agreed at Yalta in January of 1945, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, that when the Germans surrender, that Soviet troops would be involved in Asia 3 months after the Germans surrendered. May 7, 45, August 9, 1945, the Soviet Far Eastern Army attacked the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. So you want to make sure that war is over quick before they gobble up a whole bunch of territory. And that means the Japanese have to take it on the chin. And so Mr. Stalin has turned this country, you could say whatever you want about him, but when he began that program of collectivization in 1927, he takes this country to an atomic bomb by 1949. Recall what I said last week, you know, the industrialization of the Soviet Union. We are going to accomplish in 25 years what it took the United States in 100 years. But it cost the Russians. You know, again, you go to the Navy Department, and you'll find here that according to the Navy Department, this country lost 405,399 dead in World War II. Now let's take the morality out of those figures for a moment. That's only 1/3 of 1% of the American population. You know, where I work in Army Aviation Magazine, I know a general or two who would gladly pay 1/3 of 1% of the American population to get what America got out of the war. We go from being a global power to a superpower. I mean, keep in mind, in 1945, This country has more food than it could eat, more gas than it can burn, more clothes than it could wear, and more money than it could spend. And it had the bomb. We're a superpower. Yet don't sell the Soviets short. It cost them more than 405,399 dead. It cost them upwards of 25 million dead in 47 months. 1 of every 7 people in the Soviet Union died. I remember a study done at Oxford by sociologists tearing apart the Soviet population. And in 1940-41, there was 196.7 million Soviets, people in the Soviet Union, and yet for every 10 women, there were 9.1 men. And yet in 1945-46, for every 10 million women, there were 6.5 men. And you know how this country hasn't recovered from Vietnam. I don't think the Russians have quite recovered from that. That's a tall order. And many of these, and 75% of the dead in the Soviet Union were men. And many of these are what, in that group, 20 to 45 years old. Aren't these the guys that rebuild the roads? Aren't these guys that rebuild the buildings? Aren't these guys that help regenerate the population? Yeah. Ouch. That hurts. That hurts. But Stalin takes this country by this war and elevates it on the world scene. I'm going to get into that a little deeper next week. And what he's going to do, interesting what he's going to do post-war with this country. Fascinating what he tries to do here. Because now this is the beginning of what? The Cold War. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. Well, keep in mind, too, it's not, radio communications had advanced quite a bit since the 1914-18 conflict. Plus, at this point, the airplane is better. And Hitler had various command posts throughout the Reich. One of them was at a place called Vinitsa, which was further east. Of course, he had the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, where they're going to try to kill him on July 20, 1940. Stalin was in radio communication, but he also had his Stavka meetings, where he always conversed with his lead commanders, again, like Zhukov, Shapashnikov, Vatut, and so on, Ivan Konev, people like Rokossovsky, and they were constantly having meetings about the front. And so, yeah, and so you will see, too, unlike World War I, where Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia weren't quite in the communications necessary to foster a real united effort, in World War II, that won't be the case. I mean, you're going to see the ambassadors and the military talking to each other between Russia, England, and the United States. They have to at this point. There's no choice here. They have to. And you're going to, and again, Avril Harriman in the Soviet Union, George Kennan in Russia, who's really keeping an eye on what's going on because he's the one that's going to, in fact, I'll get into him more next week, talking about how Russia really was not the threat after 45 as it was painted to be. But yeah, there were numerous liaisons and communication between the governments. And again, Stalin at Tehran. Okay, thank you for telling me when you're going to invade, and I'll launch an offensive 2 weeks later. He kept his word. But again, it's easy to keep your word if you're getting something out of it. But he kept his word. And again, London and Washington appreciated the fact that this is where the German army is being ground up, not in the West. But this, although, allows the United States to do, it's a marriage made in heaven. The Soviets don't have to waste time building a huge navy. The Soviets don't have to waste time building this huge strategic air force. They build their air force to accommodate the Soviet army. Let the Allies do that. We'll take care of this. And they will. They will. And it's production. Stalin pushes this production, where the United States is going to build like 295,000 and change combat aircraft, which is astounding. That's astounding. The Soviets will build 158,000. We're going to build over 103,000 tanks. The Soviets will build anywhere from 115 to 121,000. God bless you. We'll build over 250,000 artillery pieces. The Soviets will build over 500,000. But look at the huge navy we build. Look at all the trucks we build. But we sent the Soviets a lot of clothes, a lot of radios. A big thing, radios, we sent them. And the truck. We sent them upwards of, between us, mostly us, but some of the British, 475,000 trucks. I mean, it wasn't uncommon to see a Studebaker in the Red Army. Or a GMC, you know? Yeah. I mean, that's, you know, we did send them a lot of planes, but that was only, you know, we sent them like 14,586 planes. That's 10% of what the Soviets produced. You know, 12,000 and change tanks. That's 10% of what the Soviets produced. And a lot of the tanks we sent them. You know what got me? We sent them over 4,000 Shermans. And you know, the Soviets wouldn't take them unless we put diesel engines in them. You're helping somebody here. Oh, we don't want that. You put a diesel engine in it. Well, no, that leads to the question, what the hell are our guys? Chopped liver? Doesn't the diesel engine is less of a fire hazard than a gasoline engine? Yeah. That's why the Soviets had diesel engines in their tanks. Especially like a tank like the T-34. It was, had, for its shortcomings, a great tank. Sloped armor, so a shell would hit and bounce off. Diesel engine. Had 19-inch tracks on it, so it could go through terrain almost any other tank couldn't go through. All you needed was a pair of pliers and a wrench set, and you can keep the thing running for 20 years. Wasn't the great fit and finish, but we're talking Russians. Their crews are peasants and factory workers. What do they know about Duesenbergs? Who cares? But it does what it's supposed to do. Fascinating, you know. And what's fascinating about that tank is there was a man in the United States named J. Walter Christie in the late 20s designed a tank suspension. You know, he wasn't the only one. There were others looking at those pot-belly stoves these guys were riding in World War I. You know, I mean, these things were doing 3 or 4 miles an hour. No, why not make a tank that can do 25 or 30 with a decent gun on it? In other words, that's replacing the horse, cavalry with tanks. And so he tried to sell this suspension of his to the War Department. You know what the War Department said? No. Here. You know who wanted it? Moscow. And through a series of marks of tanks all through the 30s, they finally came up with the T-34, based off an American suspension. Wow. We just didn't appreciate the tank as well as they did. The Soviets were early in this. Yeah, the tank. And yeah. And you know, the tank was to the Soviets on the Eastern Front what the aircraft carrier was to our Navy in the Pacific. That medium of mobility that will win the war. One's at sea, one's on land. It's the same, virtually the same sort of mindset here. It worked. It worked. Well, that was one of the Democratic Party, wasn't it? Roosevelt was a banker, you know. And so, yeah, they're going to be very instrumental in making American policy. They ensconce themselves in the Democratic Party, and also the Republican Party, but the Democrat. I bring up the Democratic Party because that's supposed to be the party of the working man. And so, not anymore. Long not anymore. But, I mean, the fact of the matter is, these guys are going to be instrumental in making your policy because they were ensconced in that party. I mean, Bernard Baruch, remember him? Was in charge of the War Industries Board in this country in World War I, where now we are acclimating our industry for a corporatized war. which means you really don't own your business anymore. We want so many widgets from you. We want them such and such a date. They'll be picked up and sent overseas. Everything is organized. And so you begin to see this take effect all through this country. In fact, Wall Street will throw Stalin some money for his industrialization. And this is understandable to a certain extent. To Wall Street, the dollar is as big as a bedspread. It is. And so you begin to see. In fact, what's interesting here too is George Bush's grandfather, Prescott, wasn't he holding money for the Nazis in the late 30s in his bank? Yeah, he was. And so you see the chance of making a profit here. Lenin understood that. And in fact, so did the Dulles brothers. John Foster was always a little jealous of Alan because Alan got to meet Hitler and he didn't. And Joe Kennedy, right. But you see here too, and then I'll get to your question. You see here too that even during the late 20s, Germany was oil starved. So what was one way to answer being oil starved? Using one of the processes, the Fischer-Tropsch process, to convert coal into liquefied fuels and lubricants. And they built like 34, 36 plants in Germany. The British entertained this idea and decided against it. They already had the oil in Persia. They were already pumping the oil out of Iraq, which they made. Iraq is a British invention. Sykes-Picot Agreement, them and the French. They decided they didn't want to go with the coal-producing plants. You know why? Because that might lead to Britain getting bombed. So let's take the oil out of Persia and Iraq. Interesting here, the different mindset. That's correct. You can get a lot more miles out of a gallon of oil than you can out of a pound of coal. And we're going to go the same route. Yes. But she says, what about the death of Patton? Were the Russians implicated in that? And I honestly don't know. I mean, I haven't seen any missives or any real eyewitnesses saying that. Well, yeah, that's exactly what happened. On the surface, it sounds plausible.
It was a big to-do when it happened.
Oh yeah, it was. Of course it was. But then again, was it just an accident? Well, I'm going to get into that thing about the Russians taking over. It's not as cut and dry. I'll get into that next week. It's not as cut and dry as it seems. And then I'm going to get, and you're going to hear the name George Kennan more than once next week. Well, he knew a lot. He's a fascinating American foreign policy analyst, or he was. But I'll get into more of that next week. But that is an interesting, that's like, did Franklin D. Roosevelt know Pearl Harbor was going to be bombed? We get into that one. That's another one, right, yeah. And that's I guess, can be construed as an obvious question. Well, gee whiz, they were breaking the Japanese code. They were breaking the diplomatic code, not the Navy code. And that's the one you want. That doesn't say that they shouldn't have been better prepared. I'll give you that. Was Admiral Kimmel and General Short scapegoated? Yeah, somebody just said yeah. Talking about Pearl Harbor, that they weren't ready. Well, the Navy, talking about, again, Pearl Harbor not being ready, the Navy in 1934 launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, a mock attack on a Sunday morning using the aircraft carriers Lexington and Saratoga. And so there was a mock attack in 1934. Yet 7 years later, what's going to happen? Right. And again, this comes up just after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Go back to February 8, 1904, when the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked the Russian Navy at Port Arthur. And then the next day, they declared war against Russia. Oh yeah, didn't the Japanese launch a surprise attack there? people forget the history. Or they miss it, or they forget it, it's missed. In fact, I'll give you a poster child expression. Dean Rusk, remember him? Sure, he was in the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration. He was also in the Truman administration. And he remembers when the United States and the Soviet Union were discussing where they were going to cut Korea. You know, what parallel, where the border was going to be. They decided on the 38th parallel. Well, Dean Rusk said it wasn't acknowledged at this time, but supposedly State Department and Army historians missed that the 38th parallel had been discussed by the Russians and the Japanese prior to the 1945 war. If we knew that, would you have agreed to that border? That makes you look like the Japanese or the Russians. Yeah, the Americans are just doing the same thing. They missed it. Wow. Interesting. Interesting. Yes? And 2 years after that, he will accept the Japanese invasion, bring the Great White Fleet here for a visit. And that will ameliorate this buildup of a Japanese-American friction at the time, because it will lead to the Root-Takahira Agreement of November 1908. And with that agreement, the United States will recognize the Japanese, continuation in the open door policy. We will recognize the Japanese having taken Korea, which they'll annex in 1910, and also that the Japanese have interest in Manchuria. Conversely, the Japanese will recognize the reality of us in the Philippines and Guam and Hawaii, so on and so forth. And so it seemed that for a moment here, the friction had been greased. But you know what's going to happen eventually by December 7th. And American Navy planners and Japanese Navy planners, which Navy are they planning for when they draw up their war plans? Each other's Navy. And keep in mind, but again, your point you're bringing up, revolves to a certain extent on this decline of the British as a power, and somebody's going to fill this void, and it's us and the Japanese. I mean, even at this time, at this period, what are the Japanese saying? Asia for Asians, let's throw the white Christian colonial powers out. Asia for Asians, yeah, as long as we run it. That's basically what you're seeing. And so, yeah, that's fascinating here. Asia for Asians. And so you can see, you've heard this, you've heard this, you've seen it in your newspapers, saw it on TV. It seems that military and economic and political power now is being transferred where? To Asia? Well, maybe the start of that was the Japanese Empire. Japanese couldn't do it, maybe China can. Remains to be seen, doesn't it? Remains to be seen. I mean, keep in mind here, the Japanese the Chinese are moving ahead, but look at the ground laid by the Japanese here. The late 19th century, the Japanese decide that, yes, we don't want to wind up like a China or the Dutch East Indies or India or Vietnam. We want to be an acknowledged power, so, when in Rome, do what the Romans do. So they're going to industrialize, so on and so forth. But at the same time here, they're not going to be accepted by many of these white Christian colonial powers. They got yellow skin, round head, and slanted eyes. There goes the neighborhood. And so you will see them move in as a colonial power. And of course, by 1945, the Japanese run is over. And now you're seeing China beginning to make its run. So it all remains to be seen here where this is going here. But yeah, they're quite right about naval power here. And isn't naval power an example of a country looking to extend its influence outside its borders? It always has been. Well, I wouldn't say it's falling apart. I mean, keep in mind, you don't need quite as many ships, you don't need quite as many people because of the electronics nowadays. I mean, you can get away with a frigate, with 300-400 people on it. Well, yeah, but that's training too. But I mean, the fact of the matter is here, naval power is required because even in today's world, you need a navy to keep the sea lanes open. That's what sea power does, especially choke points like the Persian Gulf, the Makassar Strait in the Pacific, places like this, because it's heavily trafficked, especially tanker traffic. The magic word, oil, back to oil again, And again, going back to the Eastern Front, I mean Russia and the United States, the Soviet Union and the United States. One of the reasons we win, the US and Soviets win, oil. Oil. Well, yeah, she's mentioning FDR at Yalta. He's sick and he's not quite up to par. That's true. However, at the same time here, by this point, even if he had been healthy, the Red Army is giving Stalin what he wants. And even by this point, Mr. Churchill is trying to get Stalin out of Poland. That's not going to happen. Even to the point where, well, gee whiz, if you don't get out of Poland, the Pope's not going to like this. Well, really, how many divisions does he have? Stalin's no dumbbell. He knows the Pope no longer has, the Papal States no longer has an army. How many divisions does he have? Who's the Pope? He's a loser. And so he's going to stay. They didn't come all this way to give up Poland and these countries to the West. They didn't come all that way for that. And so they're not going to leave. And they didn't pay all those lives to give it up. Not going to happen. And so, the world, so going back to what you're saying here, this idea of this grand alliance, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, what was the glue that held that together? Hitler. And as soon as Hitler put that bullet in his head, what happened to that glue that held together the Grand Alliance? Yeah, it's gone. There's no reason for it. And so everyone's going to go their own way here. And you're going to see the sides begin to, and especially after Roosevelt dies, who takes over? Truman. And Truman was a real friend of Stalin's. No, not really. And he'll give Molotov a dressing down when Molotov comes to Moscow. Comes to Washington. And so, Stalin has an idea where this is going. And so, okay, well, we know what we have to do. And the world will proceed. But of course, again, this is emblematic on the giant scheme here. The British and French empires are falling apart, especially the French are gone, virtually. They'll try in Vietnam and Algeria, but they're done. The British, they're done. And so you are seeing a change in the global dynamics. And so what the Europeans at once controlled, they no longer do. And so that long run of European colonialism, the Japanese, go back to what I mentioned earlier, let's get rid of the white Christian colonial powers. Yeah, that's going to happen, but then you're getting a new scheme of global dynamics. That's the United States and the Soviet Union. But then again, at the same time, you are seeing this rise of revolutionary nationalism. Ho, Mao. How about Nasser and the free officers movement in the Middle East? You're seeing that. Why? Because the empires are the colonial empires, the European colonial empires are over. So now you're seeing these people. They're done. Let's rise up and take things into our own hands here. And that's going to help to inflame the Cold War, because the United States and Soviet Union are going to want to take control of these movements. And, somebody like Ho Chi Minh, I'm a communist, but I'm more of a nationalist than I am a communist. So you got that going on. And so it's fascinating to see here where the world is going after 45. Interesting. And this war, and again, go back to what I mentioned at earlier talks, this war didn't start in 1939, it started in 1914. That's when this war started. So there really is no World War I or World War II, there is only the Great War.